Boys and girls gathered around, we have the history of the real First World War. Obviously, we know World War II. Obviously, we know World War One, but this is sometimes known as World War Zero. Like the 7 Years' War is, of course, what we're talking about. Not ever looked at this personally. Not just this video, but this entire topic I've not looked at. And I've looked at a lot. So let's uncover this together and see what the 7 years was, maybe why it happened, and what the aftermath of it looked like. Glad you're here with me. Let's jump right in.
When you think of world wars, you probably picture the two conflicts that defined the first half of the 20th century. However, just over 150 years earlier, in the middle of the 18th century.
So we're talking 1700s, okay. So, of course, 1700s, at the end of that, you're going to hit the French Revolution. Prior to that, you got the American Revolution. But I think right before the American Revolution is when this happened, right?
The world witnessed the outbreak of what could arguably be considered the first truly global conflict in human history. Across nearly every corner of the globe, from Europe to North America, and the Caribbean to India, the nations of Great Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, Russia, Spain, Sweden, and Portugal, along with countless Native American and Indian allies, fought to determine not only who would hold the balance of power in Europe, but who would rise to become the dominant colonial power on the world stage.
Dang, I didn't know it was that many countries.
This series of events, which lasted from 1756 to 1763, saw old alliances break down and new powers rise to prominence. But how did a small skirmish over a territorial dispute on the American frontier escalate into becoming the world's first truly global conflict?
That's where it started?
This is the history of the 7 Years' War.
Let's go.
The causes of the 7 Years' War lay in the outcomes of the 18th century's prior conflicts, which pitted the two dynastic powerhouses of the age.
Austria-Hungary. Dynastic. I don't know. Who's the other one?
The Bourbon kings of France.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know why I was thinking something else.
And the Habsburg dynasty of Austria against one another. For the past 50 years, each side had sought to assert its dominance over the continent and tip the balance of power in Europe in its favour. In the most recent conflict, the War of the Austrian Succession.
Don't know that. See, I don't know much about the 18th century. I know a lot more about the 19th.
Fought from 1740 to 1748, the belligerents had aligned themselves according to the time-honoured alliance system that had governed European politics throughout the late 17th and early 18th centuries.
Big ships.
France's traditional enemies, Austria and Great Britain, had coalesced, as they had done on previous occasions, and were joined by the German electorate of Hanover.
Because of George I?
Which was ruled in personal union with Britain under the Georgian kings, the Dutch Republic, as well as Russia. On the other hand, Prussia, the leading anti-Austrian state in Germany, aligned itself with France and was joined by Spain and Sweden, as well as Saxony and Sardinia, though these two would later switch sides. The war itself was largely inconclusive, having been fought to determine who should rightly inherit the Austrian throne, which ultimately remained in the hands of Empress Maria Theresa. The only notable territorial change was the prosperous province of Silesia, which passed from Austrian hands into those of the Prussian king, Frederick the Great. Although the war ended in 1748, with the signing of the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, it failed to resolve many of the underlying tensions between the signatories, and in many ways created further grounds for dispute with the agreed peace terms. By 1756, however, the alliance system of the past 50 years had begun to unravel. Anti-British sentiment had taken hold in the imperial court of Vienna, after tensions arose over London's demands for the protection of Hanover and Vienna's counter-arguments for the protection of the Austrian Netherlands from any future French aggression.
Interesting. I think that's why Belgium was eventually created, though.
Additionally, Maria Theresa was furious over Britain's acceptance of the territorial losses inflicted on Austria, as stipulated in the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. This led to Austria breaking its alliance with London and, surprisingly, developing closer relations with the traditional enemy, the French king Louis XV.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
The Dutch Republic, which was no longer threatened by France due to the Franco-Austrian alliance, did not have to serve in Britain's interest anymore, and so declared itself neutral. However, King George II of Britain now needed a continental ally to protect his Hanoverian lands from any future French threats, and so he turned to Prussia under King Frederick the Great for support. A secret alliance was formed between the two.
That's a crazy strong alliance right there.
Whereby Britain would provide financial support to Prussia
Always.
in return for its commitment to defending Hanover. Conversely, Prussia's strategic objectives were to protect its claim over Silesia and expand its territory further eastwards,
which they will,
towards the border of the Russian Empire, ruled by Empress Elizabeth. In response to this prospect of Prussian aggression, Russia maintained its alliance with Austria to counter the threat posed by Frederick the Great. This diplomatic revolution shifted the balance of power in Europe along new lines, which...
So we got Prussia, Britain, and Hanover, which is seemingly just because of Hanover and Prussia's own ambitions, seems to bring Britain into the fold because of the Hanover protectorate. And you got France joining Austria just because Austria's trying to get back at Britain. And then you got Russia aligning with Austria historically, but also combating Prussia's aggression of expansion. Got it. Where does Sweden play? Where does Spain play? Are they playing?
Which would ultimately lead to the outbreak of war once again. These political tensions, however, were not solely confined to Europe.
India.
The 18th century had seen a dramatic surge in the colonial ambitions of many European powers, but none more so than Britain and France. These two nations would fan the flames of conflict around the world, to wherever their overseas interests collided. On the Indian subcontinent, both the British and French had already established their respective East India companies.
You know what's funny? I never knew that France was in India till just now. Just now, 5 seconds ago.
To trade in the highly prized spices, textiles, and precious objects of the region, which were shipped back to Europe, where they could fetch a fortune. Although they were officially formed as trading businesses, they served to project British and French influence by proxy across the region by winning favour among local Indian rulers and, where necessary, enforcing their trading operations through military force. Both
Those are crazy uniforms, by the way.
companies had created their own private armies, consisting of local Indian soldiers, as well as imported European troops, and were extensively deployed in a series of conflicts known as the Carnatic Wars.
They need to make an Assassin's Creed game. I know that's where my head is. They need to make an Assassin's Creed game around this time in India.
These localized conflicts often overlapped with the formally declared wars in Europe, such as the most recent War of the Austrian Succession. It was in North America, however, where the
Is this the French and Indian War as well? I think it's kind of like shaded as the French and Indian War.
greatest friction between the two colonial powers was felt, and where ultimately the first shots of the 7 Years' War would be fired. For well over a century, Britain and France had carved out their own dominions across the continent, which by the mid-18th century had grown into several prosperous colonies. The British had focused their efforts along the eastern seaboard, with the 13 colonies stretching from Georgia in the south to Maine in the north, as well as the recently acquired Canadian provinces of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, which had been ceded from France in a previous conflict in 1714. The French, meanwhile, laid claim to a vast swathe of territory encompassing the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and much of the Mississippi River basin, down towards the Gulf of Mexico.
New Orleans.
The exact boundaries between the two respective possessions were ill-defined, but the French were determined to prevent any British settlers from encroaching westwards, and so constructed a series of forts, predominantly in the Ohio River Valley, to assert their claim over the territory. The most contentious of these fortifications to be built was that of Fort Duquesne.
I mean, it looks like it's the closest in proximity.
In 1754, located in what is now present-day Pittsburgh,
Oh.
The British initially tried to resolve what they perceived as an infringement.
I wonder if this fort created Pittsburgh by the location that it was set in.
Onto their territory through peaceful means. But after their protestations fell on deaf ears, they decided to dispatch a small number of colonial troops alongside native allies to drive the French out by force. The commanding officer of the expedition was a 21-year-old lieutenant colonel in the Virginia Regiment,
George Washington,
named George Washington,
yeah,
who would go on to become the first president of the United States of America in later life. Washington's men marched to the vicinity of Fort Duquesne, where they subsequently ambushed a small party of French colonial troops in the Battle of Jumonville Glen on the 28th of May, 1754. The French retaliated just over 1 week later by attacking Washington's men at Fort Necessity on the 3rd of July, forcing them to surrender. Although the 7 Years' War would not officially commence for another 2 years, these small skirmishes in the backwoods of North America formed the first engagements of a regional conflict known as the French and Indian War,
right,
and would be seen as the spark that would ignite the wider global war that was to come.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because sometimes like colonial wars get echo chambered, and while the two, they're almost like proxy wars of colonialism, even though they are the nations under each which would be represented by. It's interesting.
News spread slowly in the 18th century, but word of the fighting in the colonies eventually made its way to Britain in August. Accounts of the engagements varied widely, owing to unverified reports of the events themselves, which led to sensationalized republishings that pointed the finger of blame at one side or the other.
Yeah, and I mean, this is the time of the newspaper at the time of the pamphlets. So propagandized news has to be this is the day and the age of that. I mean, that's why the French Revolution really took apart, because news spread through pamphlets and propaganda. So I understand this completely.
Such a lack of credible information was common for the period, but sadly, these lax practices continued to blight news and media coverage, even to readers of make the media. A state of unofficial war then existed between Britain and France, with neither side offering a solution to the escalating situation. Both nations sent troops to North America in anticipation of the conflict to come. The first major British action was the assault on Acadia on the 16th of June, 1755, which was immediately followed by the expulsion of the French populace across the territory. In July, British Major General Edward Braddock led around 2,000 troops and provincial militia on a mission to retake Fort Duquesne.
Gotta get those Pittsburghs.
But the expedition ended in disastrous defeat, with Braddock himself being mortally wounded. Further engagements saw the British and French meet at the inconclusive Battle of Lake George in September of that year. Meanwhile, at sea, the British began to harass French shipping. Admiral Edward Boscawen fired on the French ship Alcide on the 8th of June, capturing it and 2 troop transports that were making their way to reinforce the colony in Quebec.
So, yeah, the British own the seas. That makes perfect sense that this happened. It's crazy, though, how dominant the British really were on the sea. Like, maybe we'll learn about British defeats in the future, but they're pretty dominant on the naval side.
The British also seized hundreds of merchant ships, captured thousands of sailors, and set up blockades around French ports, all while the two nations were nominally at peace. France responded to these provocations in the April of 1756 by launching an invasion of the British-held island of Minorca in the Mediterranean.
Is this the beginning of the 7 Years' War?
Britain finally declared war on France on the 17th of May and dispatched a naval task force under the command of Admiral John Byng to relieve the besieged garrison. After fighting an indecisive battle, Byng withdrew, and Minorca subsequently fell to the French. News of the failure to relieve the island caused uproar back in Britain, and would ultimately cost Byng his life. He was later court-martialed for failing to do his utmost against the enemy, and was executed by firing squad in the following year. France eventually declared war on Britain in June. Although the main theatre of the conflict in Europe would only break out because of the tensions between Prussia and Austria over the status of Silesia. The Austrians were determined to retake the territory, whilst Frederick the Great was determined to keep it.
Yeah, I don't know too much about Frederick the Great. Obviously, he was great, but hopefully to learn a little bit more right now.
Having already secured his much-needed alliance with Britain, Frederick moved preemptively and invaded Saxony in August 1756.
Well, we got war.
Which, at the time, was allied with Austria and France. Frederick's grand strategy was to deliver a swift, knockout blow to the Austrians.
Oh, I can see that I guarantee you France is going to invade Austria and Netherlands, right? That would make perfect sense in this scenario.
By advancing through Saxony and into Austrian territory in Bohemia, all before any threat from Russia could materialize to the east.
Is that Polish-Lithuania at this time? I'm not sure. I have no idea.
His plans, however, did not go accordingly. At the Battle of Lobositz on the 1st of October, an Austrian force of 33,000 men, under General Maximilian Ulysses Brown, managed to repel Frederick's advance. As a result, the Prussians became tied down and spent the next year trying to make a breakthrough in Bohemia. They came very close to doing so at the Battle of Prague in May 1757, but were repelled again at the subsequent Battle of Kolin in June. With the Prussian army now concentrated against the Austrians, the French took the opportunity to march into Hanover and occupied much of King George II's German homeland.
I did not expect that, but yeah, I guess go for it, bro.
The Duc d'Estrées defeated the Hanoverian army, led by the youngest son of the British king, the Duke of Cumberland, at the Battle of Hastenbeck in July. In the end, Hanover was effectively forced to capitulate early in the war by signing the Convention of Klosterzeven. Meanwhile, to the east, the Russian forces had mobilized and advanced into East Prussia under the command of Field Marshal Apraksin.
That has to be under, coordination with Austria, right? Because Russia is definitely ready to do this, but it's got to be they've had to have a green light by Austria. I know that they're not taking orders from Austria, but I'm saying they probably coordinated this with Austria.
Taking the fortress of Memel. This wave of Prussian defeats forced them to retreat into their own territory, which in turn presented an opportunity for other anti-Prussian European states to take advantage of their now weakened position. Sweden subsequently declared war on Prussia on the 22nd of September and invaded Pomerania with 17,000 men. Towards the end of 1757, Prussia faced threats on all fronts. Despite this seemingly inescapable position, however, Frederick the Great managed to pull off a series of perfectly executed maneuvers that brought about a reversal in Prussia's fortunes, which were nothing short of military genius. First, he devastated a combined French-German army at the Battle of Rossbach.
And remember, Prussia is very militarized. That's what I know, right? We saw that in Austria-Prussian War, how Austria just got destroyed because of the technology and the prowess, as well as the overall discipline and formations that Prussia offered. I'm wondering what is the art of war for Frederick the Great in this scenario? What gave Prussia an advantage?
5th of November, despite being outnumbered almost 2-1. He then turned about and routed a similarly numerically superior Austrian force at the Battle of Leuthen the following month, further solidifying his reputation as one of Europe's greatest military commanders. Finally, he turned north, driving the Swedes out of Prussian territory and occupying Swedish Pomerania in the process.
Dang.
While the initial salvos in the war were being fired in Europe, military developments were also underway in India. The region was still largely ruled by the indigenous powers of the time, with the Mughal Empire in the north, the Sultanate of Mysore in the south, and the Maratha Confederacy in the central part of the subcontinent. The British and French East India Companies had each established their own enclaves throughout the region, such as at Pondicherry and the Coromandel Coast in the case of the French, whereas the British held Madras, Bombay, and Kolkata. The Battle of Plassey, fought in the northeast of India on the 23rd of June 1757, came to be the first notable engagement of the conflict, and one which had enormous consequences. A small contingent of British East India Company troops, led by a young officer named Robert Clive, along with several thousand Indian allies, defeated an army of 50,000 under the command of the local Bengal ruler, Siraj-ud-Dowlah. The Bengalis were aided by a small French detachment, but nevertheless suffered a cataclysmic defeat at the hands of the British.
That's a crazy image right there.
Who subsequently established their control over the wider Bengal region. Thereafter, Clive and other company officials began expanding aggressively across the rest of the subcontinent. Although the French captured Cuddalore, their siege of Madras failed, allowing the British under Sir Eyre Coote to decisively defeat the remaining French forces at the Battle of Wandiwash in 1760. Pondicherry would later fall in 1761, which would effectively bring about the decline of French influence in India altogether.
Yeah, I was like I said, I wasn't sure that the French were ever in India, honestly. So when did they get in India? I can definitely tell you when they left, right here. But when did they enter?
As the first phases of conflict were unfolding across Europe and India,
North
the
America.
war that had already begun in North America continued to gain pace. The French had initially gained the upper hand in the fighting by capturing Fort Oswego in 1756 and Fort William Henry in 1757, but thereafter the superior numbers of the British began to make a difference. The colonial population of the 13 colonies by the late 1750s was around 2 million people, while that of New France was barely 100,000.
That's a big difference right there.
Once the initial forays had been launched, and the British had mobilized the full support of their colonists, the French stood little chance of emerging victorious. By 1758, the British had secured their western frontier by capturing Fort Duquesne and Fort Frontenac, and had begun to take the fight to the French colonies in Canada. The fortress of Louisbourg was captured in July of that year, but not before the French had managed to thwart a British overland advance through upstate New York at the Battle of Carillon, which would prove to be the bloodiest battle fought in the North American theatre of the war. This turnaround in British military fortunes was largely owed to the emergence of William Pitt, the new Secretary of State in London.
Pittsburgh?
He proposed a strategy that would seek to tie up the French in a costly land war in Europe by providing vast sums of financial aid to Britain's ally in the form of Prussia, whilst the Royal Navy, with a few accompanying army detachments, would be deployed to attack French ports in a series of raids known as descents. Assaults were carried out against the town of Rochefort in 1757 and Cherbourg in 1758, but were of limited and mixed success. It was therefore decided instead to focus on France's more lucrative and exposed overseas possessions.
The Caribbean. What is that? I can't remember. I can't remember what that is. Is that Haiti? No. I'm losing my mind. It could be. I think that is Haiti.
The French-controlled sugar-producing colonies in the Caribbean were incredibly valuable in terms of the revenue.
Oh, yeah, Guadeloupe and Martinique. Those two are going to go to Britain.
They generated for the nation's coffers. So much so that the two islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique were worth more to the French economically than the whole of New France.
That's crazy.
In November 1758,
but that's crazy.
8 ships of the line were dispatched to the Caribbean with the objective of seizing Martinique. But after determining that it was too well defended, they instead sailed on to Guadeloupe in January 1759. Despite tropical disease breaking out and decimating the British troops, the island was eventually captured in the spring, although it would be another 3 years before Martinique was taken. The war had also expanded to the continent of Africa by this point, after the British sent a flotilla to capture
this is a full-on world war.
Fort Louis and the French slave trading stations in what is now Senegal in April 1758. Back in Europe, the British government had managed to persuade King George II to disregard the treaty that had seen Hanover surrender in the previous September and had it re-enter the war.
Ah.
Britain also
Yeah, because of course the Hanoverian dynasty, I think this is George II at the time. George III comes after. George I was the first who spoke pretty much German at the time. He's Hanoverian. That is where the dynasty, that's why, of course, that's connected.
Dispatched some 9,000 troops to reinforce the Hanoverian army, now under the command of Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick, who succeeded in driving the French from the territory by the spring of 1758. In Eastern Europe, the Russians had seized control of East Prussia during the winter, and were now threatening to advance into Prussia's heartland, further to the west. Frederick the Great mustered an army of 30.
Russia versus Prussia is a crazy battle. I guarantee you this is about to be crazy.
5,000 men to meet the Russians at the Battle of Zorndorf on the 25th of August. The engagement ultimately proved inconclusive and extremely costly, with the Russian army of just over 40,000, led by Wilhelm von Fermor, failing to break through the Prussian lines, costing both sides in excess of 10,000 men killed or wounded. The lack of a major breakthrough by either side in the war so far, however, would come to an end as a result of Britain's efforts in the year 1759. The British knew that they could never match the strength of the French army on land, and vice
at sea,
versa. The French knew that they could not challenge the might of the Royal Navy on the high seas. Despite this impasse, the French orchestrated a plan for an amphibious assault and invasion of Britain.
When will they learn? Well, I mean, I guess this isn't post-Napoleonic, so I guess they're about to learn.
Which would involve sailing an army across the Channel in flat-bottomed boats.
They try to pull a Norman conquest.
And landing on the south coast of England. William Pitt became aware of the French intentions and ordered the Royal Navy's Admiralty to eliminate any possibility of an invasion whatsoever.
Yeah.
Consequently, in August that year, a British squadron under the command of Edward Boscawen scattered the French Mediterranean fleet at the Battle of Lagos.
There are so many battles right there in like a 200-year time frame.
Then, on the 20th of November, at the Battle of Quiberon Bay, Admiral Edward Hawke, with 24 ships of the line, engaged the French Brest fleet, sinking, capturing, and forcing many of them aground, thereby putting an end to the threat of a French invasion of Britain. Victory at Quiberon Bay.
And how did those admirals stack up to like Nelson and company?
Came on top of numerous other French defeats in 1759. In New France, the British won a pivotal victory at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham on the 13th of September, where some 4,000 British troops, under the command of Major General James Wolfe, clashed with a force of French soldiers, led by Lieutenant General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, just outside the city of Quebec. Although the British emerged victorious, Wolfe himself was mortally wounded in the fighting, and likewise, so was the French commander, Montcalm, who died of his wounds in the battle's aftermath. The British capture of Quebec paved the way for the wider conquest of Canada in the years that followed.
Yeah, I was about to say, that's how Canada became about right there.
Which subsequently ended the French Empire in North America altogether. The year 1759 would henceforth become known as an annus mirabilis, a miracle year in British history, owing to the wave of successes it achieved over its arch-colonial rival.
And I mean, this large part to their navy. Large part.
Despite the British successes in 1759, things did not go so well for their Prussian allies. Defeats at the Battle of Kay in July at the hands of the Russians, and the surrender of an entire Prussian corps of 13,000 men to the Austrians at the Battle of Maxen in November were highly damaging. But the biggest and most costly Prussian defeat of that year, and one which nearly ended Frederick the Great's reign as king, came on the 12th of August. 50,000 Prussians met a combined Austrian-Russian army of 60,000 men, led by Ernst von Lauden and Piotr Saltykov, at the Battle of Kunersdorf. Both sides struggled in the difficult terrain, resulting in one of the bloodiest battles to be fought in Europe during that era. Upwards of 40,000 troops were killed or wounded in the clash, and the Prussian army collapsed into an undisciplined mess. Fortunately for Frederick, he was able to escape with some of his troops, owing to an uneasy alliance existing between
Are they going to siege Berlin?
Austria and Russia, which manifested in the latter not committing their troops to pursue the fleeing Prussians. It therefore fell to the Austrians to follow up on the victory at Kunersdorf by seizing Prussian territory. Despite the first half of 1760 bringing yet more defeats, with the Austrians winning the Battle of Landeshut in June and the Swedes retaking parts of Pomerania, Frederick nevertheless managed to regroup his forces and made a stand at the Battle of Liegnitz on the 15th of August 1760. There, he inflicted a crushing defeat on von Lauden's army, despite being outnumbered 3-1. By this point in the war, every government involved was feeling the stress of maintaining the fight over several years. The war from 1760 onwards entered a period of stalemate, and although each side continued to field armies to try and make a breakthrough, most realized that a major victory would not be forthcoming. As a result, most sought to disentangle themselves and establish peace on the best terms possible.
I mean, I haven't seen much from like Spain. I know they're like color on the map. Same with like Sardinia. What's going on there?
The only exception to this sentiment came from Spain.
Never mind.
Which, despite being ruled by the House of Bourbon,
the
same royal line that ruled France,
had
thus far remained neutral in the conflict. Matters changed, however, in 1759, when King Charles III ascended to the Spanish throne. He was more inclined to intervene in the war, particularly after France suffered major reversals in the Americas. Charles was fearful that if Britain managed to establish a more dominant position in North America and the
Is he going to take Florida?
Caribbean, it would soon be trying to acquire Spain's possessions in the New World.
Oh, wait, that's already there. I'm so smart.
Thus, he began adopting a more pro-French stance, which by 1762 resulted in diplomatic tensions between London and Madrid, escalating to the
I mean, they're both Bourbons, so like it makes sense.
Point where the British declared war on Spain. Portugal, an ally of Britain, also joined the fight and subsequently declared war on its Iberian neighbor.
That's interesting. I didn't expect that. I thought they would be more closely aligned.
3 major military operations then occurred almost simultaneously across different parts of the world. First, a British expedition set sail in March 1762 under the command of Admiral George Pocock. It wound its way through the Caribbean in April, gathering other ships and troops in the West Indies before launching an attack on the Spanish-controlled island of Cuba in June. The British laid siege to Havana with some 30,000 men over a 10-week period, before the city finally fell in mid-August. By then, another expeditionary force of a dozen ships and 10,000 troops under Vice Admiral Sir Samuel Cornish
India
was bearing down on another of Spain's
I was about to say Philippines, probably.
possessions on the far side of the world, the Philippines.
Yeah.
After a brief siege, the Governor-General, Archbishop Manuel Rojo, surrendered Manila to the British in early October. Finally, back in Europe, the Spanish and French had launched a combined invasion of Portugal in the spring of 1762. But despite an immense numerical and strategic advantage, the Franco-Spanish army was repulsed by a combined Anglo-Portuguese force on 3 separate occasions, the last taking place in early November. Thus, by the winter of 1762, less than a year after Britain and Spain had gone to war, the latter had lost its foremost city in the Caribbean, as well as the Philippines, to British forces.
They took many L's there.
Additionally, Spanish efforts to occupy Portugal, which should have been a relatively easy target,
Well, you mean that's what Napoleon thought too.
had failed, meaning that Spain was effectively defeated in just 10 months. The other major development of 1762 was Russia's switching of allegiance. In the previous year, the Russians had managed to capture the port of Kolberg on the Baltic coast, which subsequently allowed their troops to receive supplies by sea, rather than via the greatly overstretched land route. This threatened to swing the balance of power decisively against Frederick the Great. Britain even began to speculate that a total Prussian collapse was imminent, and pressured Frederick to consider offering concessions to secure a more favourable peace. Then, suddenly, on the 5th of January 1762, the Russian Empress Elizabeth died.
Oh, I was about to say, why would it happen? But regime change, that's why it happened.
And with her went the staunch anti-Prussian sentiment that had dominated Russian foreign policy.
Who's next on the line? I can't remember. I cannot remember. It's not Catherine, right? I don't think it's Catherine.
For the past 20 years. Her death was followed by the accession of Peter III.
That's right. And
then Catherine the Great.
Yeah, then yeah.
In quick succession. Both Peter and Catherine had been born in Germany and had sympathies with the Prussian cause, which completely changed Russia's stance in the war. Under Peter III's brief 7-month reign, Russia abandoned its Austrian ally and joined with Prussia and Britain.
Isn't that crazy how Hanover gets sympathy by England or Britain, and then likewise, it just depends where your heritage is from, I guess.
Summer of 1762, Frederick the Great was in receipt of Russian contingents of troops and had secured a peace treaty with Sweden, which transformed the war in Europe. Frederick then went on the offensive and recaptured much of Silesia. The Russians, now under the rule of Catherine the Great, having helped Frederick retake lost territory, then exited the war.
Isolation, yeah.
Meanwhile, the long-standing British naval blockade of French ports had by now sapped the morale of the French populace, and the recent exit of both Sweden and Russia from the war, in conjunction with Frederick's retaking of Silesia, convinced King Louis XV that his war objectives were no longer obtainable. He therefore made peace with Frederick and withdrew from Prussia's Rhineland territories, thereby ending France's involvement in the war in Germany. By late 1762, concerted negotiations were underway to bring the wider war to an end. They culminated in 2 separate peace treaties, signed within days of each other in February 1763. The Treaty of Hubertusburg concerned the war in Central Europe between Prussia and Austria, and essentially returned the possessions of each nation back to their pre-war borders. 5 days prior to the signing of this, the Treaty of Paris had been conducted between the French and Spanish on one side, and the British and Portuguese on the other. There was no doubt that this was an unequivocal victory for Britain, with France having ceded all its territory in North America east of the Mississippi River to them. The territory to the west of this
became French, which Napoleon will sell not too long from now.
In Louisiana, was given to the Spanish.
Oh!
In exchange for the British receiving Florida.
Never mind, I'm smart.
France's colonies in the Caribbean were nevertheless restored, evidencing just how valuable they were when faced with the choice between relinquishing control of New France or giving up Martinique and Guadeloupe.
Yeah, it's on the balance books at that point.
The terms of the treaty were less clear on India, though the British East India Company was now clearly the dominant foreign power in the region. The French did, however, continue to have a small presence on the subcontinent.
Oh, wow.
That would persist for the next 2 centuries.
Oh, wow. I did not know this.
Aside from the territorial changes, the conclusion of the 7 Years' War resulted in wider political and socio-economic developments that would define the remaining years of the 18th century. All nations had been virtually bankrupted by the war, although
So let's tax the colonies.
Britain especially needed to recoup the costs it had incurred from defending the 13 colonies. Consequently, a new system of taxation was introduced to raise treasury revenues in North America. However, this angered many colonists, as they had no political representation in the British Parliament and could not legitimately protest their grievances. Within 12 years, the American colonies had erupted into open rebellion, and having witnessed the British successes that had been achieved in the previous conflict, many nations within Europe now viewed Britain as being a greater threat than France. When the American Revolutionary War turned into a wider conflict between 1778 and 1783, Britain found itself standing alone against a coalition of nations who were determined to redress the balance of power once more.
Yeah, really. besides Hesse, you know, the county of Hesse. Let's go back here because obviously the 7 Years' War is actually like a line in the sand where we can look at, for example, the Bourbon dynasties are going to lead into the Napoleonic Wars. You have the Prussia or Austria situation with Silesia, which creates a eventually a Germanic state, as well as like the Austro-Prussian War. You have Russia encroaching, which will continue with the partition of Poland. You have the thing that's going to create the American Revolution with the Great Britain, basically funding all this. You have so much, like just so much chaos. This was very interesting and very informative, though. I really appreciate this channel. So go follow them or subscribe to them. Videos in the description for you guys to get to their channel, of course. Amazing channel. We've done so many videos on them so far. But guys, appreciate you guys here. Leave me some video comments down below, things that you want me to react to, but also more importantly, let me know what you thought. Let me know any context that would be interesting to add onto this. If there's subsequent videos that I need to watch that are related to this, let me know. I'll see you guys next time. Peace out and bye-bye.